If you read as much as the full title of this project, you probably know I am talking about cartoon animation, and that in some way I must be trying to convince you of its impact and its uniqueness relative to performance. You may be wondering, why? Why cartoons? Who gives a flying Flintstones about cartoons? Well, I do. When I was first learning what it materially meant to be called a faggot, and when the feelings of safety that I wasn't experiencing in school weren't undermined by the preachings in my church, but rather were justified by them, cartoons offered me a particular sense of identity that aggressively ran counter to the everyday self-loathing I had become accustomed to. I won't delve too far into those particular details here, but around those experiences, I learned that cartoons can produce a sense of freedom and agency for one's body and mind, can produce a feeling that quite literally anything is possible. My work later in life, more removed from those circumstances of feeling consistently unsafe in my body, still reflects that sense of freedom and agency I found in the unapologetic vibrance of animation, and not just because it helps me feel a lot more comfortable about things like riding around on an electric scooter in a town arguably defined by a love of pickup trucks and RVs. Whenever I have the opportunity to dance or choreograph or direct or to play a new character on the stage, I approach the work inspired by that unapologetic vibrance of cartoons that feels familiar enough to comprehend and yet presents itself so boldly and vividly and dynamically as to be both comprehensible and simultaneously removed from everything we think of as familiar and conventional and limiting. As cartoons for the screen, I've learned to try to create for the stage moments and characters and compositions that align with some basic elements of what audiences expect in a performance, but only just enough to create the opportunity to subvert those expectations and perform something just as real, just as attractive, but far less expected, so that the opportunity can be generated to offer through performance different ways of seeing. And I don't doubt that these kinds of lasting and impactful sensations of freedom and agency are often just as real for people who have a love of literature and a love of cinema and a love of theater and a love of also etc. And my purpose here is not to inflate cartoons to be more than they are, but instead to demonstrate how they are so much more than they are often given credit for. The impact of cartoons, honestly, is the easy part. Lots and lots and lots of people watch cartoons, not just children, but certainly the impact of cartoons on young people is difficult to ignore. Children don't really passively do anything. They are always absorbing, right? And if you are watching this now, then you have at some point probably been a child, and in some likelihood were a child that grew up watching at least some cartoons. If you were born in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, you have lived through more than one so-called animation revolution. So a significant portion of what children, especially in the West, absorb is, and has been for decades, cartoons. Cartoons matter. How their messages are absorbed and what it means for a cartoon to convey a sense of identity matters equally. Carmen Lugo and Mary Bloodsworth Lugo noted that cartoon films guide U.S. children through the complexities of highly racialized and sexualized scenarios, normalizing certain dynamics and rendering others invisible in the process. Again, they normalize certain dynamics and they render others invisible. Cartoons leverage our identity and our view of identity. They play a real role in communicating to us at an age when we are particularly susceptible to establishing patterns of behavior, what counts as normal and acceptable and what counts as mutable and dismissible. Judith Butler infamously called into question the concept of identity, calling performativity the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names. So through our repetition of the discursive practices that surround us, social habits, behaviors, attitudes, etc., we perform our identities as understood accordingly. In doing so, we contribute to that same social discourse, perpetuating the repetition of those social habits. Likewise, when we choose not to repeat, but instead reject those social habits by performing differently, we alter the social discourse. This is because through our performances that are different, we offer other social bodies that inhabit our shared social space new material that can be observed, experienced, and itself eventually repeated. I have taken Butler's theory to understand the performance of identity as being embodied, fluid, socially leveraged, and potentially subversive. Cartoons, like other mass media, are exactly these. Cartoons and other media are performative. They embody concepts and cultures and behaviors in that the concepts and cultures and behaviors that they depict originate and become repeated outside of themselves. And in this way, media have a material existence.
And this is quite similar to the ways Butler talks about the
presuppositions of sex being used to frame the expectations from gendered performance, which itself is a matter of embodying and acting into the world those presuppositions,
arbitrary as they are. This kind of materiality diverts attention from depictions of bodies as in characters in cartoons and other media, and instead brings attention to the ways in which cartoons and other media as holistic products, as in complete TV series or films, enact a kind of embodiment. Cartoon Network's very queer children's cartoon, Steven Universe, is a good example of this kind of embodiment. In a basic sense, the show is about the relationship between an adventure-loving boy, an almost painfully common trope in animation, and his relationship with alien rock warriors who guide and protect him. The show embraces depictions of homosexual relationships and transgender figures in a way that would have likely never made its way onto a mainstream children's network even a decade ago. Aesthetically, the show draws from many of the tropes of American beach city culture, and so Steven Universe frames its imagery with an imagery many find familiar and accessible. Out of its popularity, the imagery of Steven Universe makes its way from the screen and into everything from apparel and accessories to academic literature, such as Eli Dunn's Steven Universe, Fusion Magic, and the queer cartoon Carnivalesque. And one can argue, as Dunn alludes, that the explicit queerness in Steven Universe embodies a social appetite for vibrant queer representation, thereby playing a role in shaping discourses of queerness among young and older fans alike. And this same kind of embodiment through the origination and regeneration of content can be seen in shows like the 2012 incarnation of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Dragon Ball Super, two action-adventure cartoons that draw from their own relatively iconic histories as well as from contemporary pop culture references, all of which together work through the shows at reshaping their franchise's own ongoing fandoms and the discourses among and around them. Cartoons and other media are fluid, changing over time. The media of today perform differently than the media of past decades, and season 1 of a show that premieres tomorrow will perform differently than it does in its series finale. We can see this kind of fluidity in a very basic sense in a show like the secret agent office comedy parody, Archer, in which not only do the aesthetics of the show evolve as the seasons progress, but the show's delivery and structure shift around as well. In Archer, we go from the visual ambiguities of period, uncertain what decade the show even takes place in, but always sort of addressing aesthetics of the 1960s and 70s interwoven with elements of various other decades, and by season 8, we shift explicitly into an aesthetic of 1940s Hollywood. Archer also originally operates according to a primarily episodic formula, whereby individual episodes mostly work independent of one another, while occasionally introducing content or circumstances that fit into a larger Archer narrative. But by later seasons, the series performs within narratives that are contained by entire seasons, rather than within individual episodic stories. And so we can see how the show's patterns of performance are by no means fixed. And these same kinds of aesthetic and structural changes can be seen across mainstream animation. Batman the Animated Series changed its appearance radically later in its life, and in a way that left a lasting imprint on the Batman franchise. King of the Hill very much progressed in the quality of its animation, but its delivery also evolved in terms of the pacing of episodes, and its content also evolved in terms of how the show addressed politically sensitive topics, at least more politically sensitive for its time, such as the emotional coming out of Bug, the father of the character Dale, in season 6 that aired from 2001 to 2002. Butler talks about how it is impossible to separate out gender from the political and cultural intersections in which it is invariably produced and maintained, signaling how performances of identity are not simply manipulated by some kind of singular social force external to one's body, but instead are very much a matter of complicated socio-political circumstances, which themselves are in flux. And if those circumstances are in flux, then the ways in which they influence identity must be in flux as well. And media, like any other social body, exist among those fluctuating circumstances. We can see from this that not only is the fluidity of cartoons and other media present in their aesthetic and delivery, like with Archer and others, but also in how they extend out of and relate to their dynamic respective social contexts. Butler says of the performance of identity that the subject is a consequence of certain rule-governed discourses that govern the intelligible invocation of identity, pointing out again to the ways in which the repetition of behavior essentially makes behavior socially comprehensible. The repetition of behavior does not originate that behavior in subjects who perform an identity, but rather it plays a significant role in shaping the limitations of subjects' performances of identity. Cartoons, in this same way, are socially leveraged because, like us, they face punishment when they perform outside the repeated boundaries of acceptability. Shows and films today still get canceled or are never even greenlit for production when they are too politically sensitive or too gay. And out of these conditions for existing in the mainstream, virtually all mainstream media walk a line of acceptable content both within social contexts and within that, the contexts of programming. This is why shows like Rugrats and The Fairly Odd Parents and Pokemon, which essentially never become politically heated or ethically charged in their content, get produced and shown on so-called kid-friendly networks, and why shows like Futurama and The Boondocks and Rick and Morty, which all comedically but explicitly address politically heated and ethically charged issues, are featured on networks or on special programming blocks specifically designated for older viewers. The reining in of media through social leverage parallels how we have seen depictions of queerness in cartoons ebb and flow over the past several decades, and how we have seen those depictions slowly progress very much in line with larger public outlooks on queerness. We can see the explicit physical abusing of queer bodies in old cartoon shorts like Oob Iwerk's Sinbad the Sailor, and even in an old Mickey Mouse comic strip. We can see the comic framing of queerness through Gus in Cinderella, whose effeminate characteristics are made to be laughed at, and through Velma in Scooby-Doo, whose not feminine enough characteristics are made to be laughed at as well. We can see the villainizing of queerness consistently throughout several Disney films, including Scar from The Lion King, whose stereotypically gay mannerisms are made to be associated with his treacherous and self-serving and reckless and downright evil behaviors. These have been, over the decades, the socially acceptable, socially leveraged ways to perform queerness through cartoons and other media. And yet cartoons and other media are potentially subversive. Because even though there are boundaries that mark certain performances of identity as deviant and unacceptable, from time to time, they perform outside those boundaries anyway. And when they do, they perform into the ether new ranges of behavior that are available to be emulated and repeated by media that follow. As Butler points out, if the rules governing signification not only restrict, but enabled the assertion of alternative domains of cultural intelligibility, then it is only within the practices of repetitive signifying that a subversion of identity becomes possible. Because Steven Universe, which premiered in 2013, is as consistently queer as it is, the Disney series Star vs. the Forces of Evil likely had a lot more leeway when they subtly aired a gay kiss in 2017. For that matter, the slow integration of queerness into mainstream children's cartoons in general probably draws some agency from the fact that adult-oriented cartoons like The Simpsons and South Park have, for years, included gay characters and relationships in their long drawn-out processes of ridiculing virtually everyone. Marshall McLuhan talks about how advancements in communication technologies, which are the same technologies we associate with mass media like radio, television, and the internet, do not exist independently of much older methods of communication like speech and text, but rather are built out of much older methods. Cartoons in this same way do not operate in a communicative or performative vacuum, but instead extend out of other established ways of knowing and engaging with messages. McLuhan says that the content of any medium is always another medium, and he emphasizes that the power of media generally, because of their form, is that they essentially constitute, or at least heavily inform, the effectiveness and impact of the messages they carry. Cartoons, again, are not entirely distinct from other media, but they are unique in their vibrantly fluid form that is at once obscure and fantastical while still managing to draw us in. The performativity of cartoons is distinct from the performativity of representational media like live-action film and television. Cartoons undermine our social expectations, performing questions of race, sexuality, gender, ability, and much, much more, just like other TV shows and movies have done for generations. But the very nature of cartoons is what cartoons do differently. Walter Ong points out that the process of creating a text for a hypothetical audience is complex and fraught with uncertainties, alluding to the idea that in order for audiences who engage with a given text to understand it or to want to engage with it at all, authors have to approach the text with an understanding of and appreciation for how their audiences decide to partake of any given medium. And this is exactly how, within the context of their vivid and malleable form, cartoons operate. When we watch a cartoon, we are almost always anchored in by some kind of familiarity. Cartoons may not look real because they in fact are not photographic representations of anything or anyone, but their various features contain enough of what we consider real for us to accept them as real enough. SpongeBob and Patrick look very little like people, but we recognize them as having faces and appendages similar to that of real people, and they talk enough like real people, and they talk about experiences that we recognize as at least similar to our own experiences, that we find ourselves simply accepting their circumstances, even if only for the purposes of entertainment, as legitimate. So we find ourselves accepting these circumstances, and by association, we find ourselves to some extent also accepting the absurdity of the form in which these circumstances are taking place. When we watch cartoons, we are engaging with representations of, for example, a talking sponge, a talking starfish, a talking octopus named for a squid, and a talking crab who happens to be in a rivalry with a talking plankton over one's monopoly of an underwater hamburger patty recipe. When we engage with SpongeBob SquarePants, we engage with all of the obfuscation of reality that comes with it. SpongeBob SquarePants, like so many other cartoons, primes us to accept that which is not normal. The Legend of Korra, a critically acclaimed action-adventure fantasy children's cartoon, ended in 2014 by establishing a same-sex romantic relationship between the show's lead character and another major supporting character. Fans who engaged with the series saw multiple incarnations of heterosexual relationships establish and dissolve as the themes and the tone of the show shifted and evolved over its 4 seasons. In Korra, unlike in SpongeBob, proportions of the characters and environments were comparable to those in real life. People and places looked more like real people in real places than they do in a lot of other cartoons. But Korra was a show in which individuals used a kind of fantastical power to bend fire or to fly or to hurl giant boulders and shards of ice through the air. So The Legend of Korra was still a show whose stories relied on depictions of heightened realism. And so if fans of the show could accept from the onset that using magic to control the elements with your mind or your body is a normal thing to engage with, then watching 2 women, Korra and Dasani, hold hands and stare lovingly into each other's eyes probably doesn't feel as far-fetched as it would in another context. When cartoons subvert our expectations, they do so in a way that prepares us to deviate from the norm simply through their inherently fantastical function. Anime scholar Susan Napier, in her article The Problem of Existence in Japanese Animation, elaborated on the psychologically transcendent nature and derived social influence of cartoons, stating that our environment is in a constant state of mutability and flux, and the division between the world of mutability, dreams, and the unconscious, and the hard and fast real is an increasingly ambiguous one. She thus communicates about an unhinging of the unconscious recognition that the separation between what is real and what is imagined simply is not concrete. Like I said, there is an argument to be made for the performativity of all media, yet animation is extremely plastic and vivid and amenable to the inclinations and ambitions of its creators and its viewers. The plasticity of cartoons allows them to connect with viewers on a different plane of understanding, more forcefully unsettling expectations and at the same time offering new ways of exciting the mind. Cartoon animation can make us more responsive and susceptible to socially challenging issues. It offers us an imaginative channel through which to reflect on the standards that we perform. Animation's illusory, fantastical, and highly malleable qualities closely reflect what Butler calls the fundamentally phantasmic status of gender. The role that gender plays as something that is repeated to a point of being not only exaggerated but in many ways phantasmic is not unlike the exaggerated and fantastical nature of cartoon animation. The imposition of normality, the complex pressure to conform, not only applies to the social individual person, but to virtually any social body. And that includes media, that includes cartoons. Our socially performed appetites and opinions are what constitute the agency of mediated form, and animated form in particular is unique in its otherworldly aesthetic capabilities and in its capacity to move us with imagery of the intangible, to undermine the impositions in life that confine our bodies, and to help us to access the abnormality of identity so that we can live more freely.